Happy Monday, everyone. This is Martha with Nature Niche, and this week I thought I would talk to you about invasive species control for garlic mustard. It is going gangbusters right now. Had a slow start with our cool spring, but the Latin name is Alliaria petiolata, and it does a fair bit of ecological harm. So it's a good one to know how to identify and control on your properties and local public lands. It is a pretty nasty invasive in woodlands and along shaded borders and things like that, and it can dominate a forest or woodland floor within 5 to 7 years of introduction. So it can act pretty quickly. It harms our native wildflower populations by competing with them for both light and just space. It's a very aggressive grower, and so it'll outcompete things like trillium and spring beauty and our violets and other spring ephemeral species in the ground cover, as well as our native tree seedlings. And it's also harmful to some of our native butterfly species. Those native species that tend to lay their eggs on our native mustard plants, because garlic mustard is in the mustard family. They'll lay their eggs on those plants and they'll start their development, but because garlic mustard is a different chemical composition from our native mustards, the larvae actually die before they can reach maturity. So it's this bad ecological sink for some of our native butterflies. An example is the West Virginian white. It also chemically inhibits mycorrhizal activity in the soil, and that interferes with critical processes that are necessary for our native plants to be able to take up nutrients and water. So harms our ecosystems on multiple fronts. As far as habitat goes, you can find it in forests, along forest edges, especially along riverbanks and roadsides, other places where soil that was contaminated with seed was dumped. It was introduced from Europe by settlers in the early 1800s, most likely as a food plant. So it grows very early in the spring, and it is a high source of vitamin A and C, so would have been helpful to the settlers. And they used to use it, they'd boil it in soups or eat it like salad. Now I would say if you have a population you're controlling and you know it hasn't been sprayed with anything, you could do things like make pesto out of it and throw a pulling pesto party for garlic mustard. So as far as identification goes, one of my favorite and easy ones is scratch and sniff. It does have a very garlicky odor when you take the leaves and crush them or tear them up. So I have different stages of the plant here. The seedlings are tiny little kidney-shaped to heart-shaped leaves with a scalloped margin. And then those plants the first year form a basal rosette of leaves. And then the second year, the plant bolts up and begins flowering, and then the plant will die after it has flowered and produced seed. So those bolting plants, they can get up to 1 foot to 3 feet tall. I'm noticing this year they're flowering at a much lower height than I'm used to, but I think that's because we had that really cool spring, and they didn't really start growing till the last few warm days that we've had. The leaves are alternate along the stem, so come off at alternating points along the stem. They are heart-shaped and have rounded, fairly irregular toothed margin. And I think the veins are kind of sunken or impressed. And again, if in doubt, you can tear a leaf, take a whiff. Yep, definitely smells like garlic. So you can do that. Some lookalikes would be our native violets, which also have heart-shaped leaves, but their toothing is sharper and much more regular in pattern. Maybe gill over the ground, that's a non-native plant. It isn't particularly invasive. I wouldn't worry if you accidentally pull some of that. What other ID characteristics? The flowers are white with 4 petals, which is a characteristic of things in the mustard family. So it has small clusters of white flowers. Each flower is about 1/4 inch across. I don't have any seed pods to show you yet, but they look like tiny string beans. They're a very long, narrow green pod called calyx, and they can get 1 inch to 2.5 inches long, and they split open along multiple seams to release oblong black seeds. This plant also has a long taproot. I'll show you. Here's a bag that I pulled with my neighbors in our local community park today. So the taproot is sort of S-shaped, kind of does a little jog right under where the leaves and stems attach. And the plant does start growing very early in the spring, so you might see the little seedlings or those basil rosettes green up ahead of many of even our spring ephemeral wildflowers. And as far as management goes, it's pretty easy to hand pull, especially small patches when the soil is moist. That's pretty easy to do. You can also take like a string trimmer if you have a larger patch and cut the plants back to the ground. You might want to do that repeatedly and try to do that before they start flowering. Some plants will sprout back though and try to flower again, so be prepared to do that multiple times. You can also spray with herbicide either early spring or late fall. When either before our natives start growing or when they've senesced in the fall. And for that, you can use glyphosate. Trade name for that or product name would be Roundup at 1 to 2%. Just remember that's non-selective, and if you're working in an area with a lot of good native vegetation, you might be better off hand pulling and avoiding incidental damage from overspray and use of herbicide. You don't want to leave flowering plants that you've pulled, so they come out fairly easily. You don't want to leave them on site because once they start flowering, they will continue that process. Use reserves in the roots and just keep on going through fruit production and go to seed. So you want to make sure you collect, bag them, take them off site. I would label your bags, invasive plant material for landfill, and it's totally fine to landfill that material rather than leave them on site to produce more seed. And you don't want to try and do any sort of treatment if they've gotten away from you and already started fruit production. By getting in there with a weed whip or just walking around trying to hand pull and bag, you might inadvertently do more harm than good and spread the seed around more. So sometimes it's best to just leave it be and have a game plan ready to go the next spring for treating it. It's important to focus on small peripheral patches. I know sometimes our tendency is to jump right into the biggest patch and try to go for that, but I would focus on areas with high vegetation quality, so lots of good native ground cover species. Start there first and work your way towards the bigger populations. And you want to make sure you clean your shoes and any tools or any digging equipment. Make sure you get all the loose soil off and contained. You don't want to track the seed to new sites. And you might want to consider reporting your effort. The Stewardship Network has their spring challenge going on right now through July 5th. And that counts for invasive species management. It used to be garlic mustard focused, but they've broadened it out to include all sorts of invasive species management efforts, pulling, cutting, burning, doing monitoring, cleanup, native replanting after efforts, and you can report your man hours for that particular challenge. I'll provide a link for that. So I'm gonna pull these guys in my own yard, and I hope that gives you some good information so you can work on controlling this species on your own property. Thanks and have a good week.